From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress. That makes me the Library of Congress's reading promoter, and it's always a great pleasure to bring an author here who has a special connection with the Library of Congress. Our series is called Books and Beyond, and indeed it consists of a series of author talks about new books that have a special connection with the Library of Congress. Often that connection is using the library's collections, which is the case today with this wonderful book which we're going to hear about today from our author, Doug Wilson. Other times it's a project that has a special connection with the Library of Congress. Other times it's an author who has used photos from the Library of Congress's collections, but it's a way for us to make the Library of Congress's collections and spirit come alive by showing that we are tied closely to the contemporary publishing scene. The Center for the Book, and I've put a list of our program on the table, has affiliates in all 50 states. Our job is to stimulate public interest in books and reading, and also to encourage the study of the role of books, reading, and literacy in our country. So I'm a lucky person to have this job, and I'm also fortunate to be involved with the National Book Festival. This year's National Book Festival on the Mall will be on September 29th, and I hope that many of you will be able to join us. It will be our 7th book festival, and last year we had a crowd of over 100,000 people, and you also are able to see the authors' performances on the Library of Congress's website. Today's talk by Doug Wilson is also being filmed for the library's website. Doug is going to talk to us about the book, and there will be a chance for a short question and answer period with a book signing following. And there are still books available if you haven't purchased one yet. We hope there will be questions. When you ask a question, though, you in effect are giving them, not in effect, you are giving the Library of Congress permission to film you and your question for broadcast later on our website. I do hope that you'll take a look at the Center for the Book's website. There are over 65 past talks on the website, and it'll help give you a snapshot of contemporary American writing, just as the same thing happens with the National Book Festival website. To introduce our speaker, I am pleased to present John Sellers from the Library of Congress's Manuscript Division. John is the library's Manuscript Division's Lincoln and Civil War specialist. John? Let's give John a hand.
Thank you. Nice crowd. Galesburg, Illinois is a prairie town, and Doug has spent most of his career. He's a man of the prairie. It's the birthplace of Carl Sandburg. I am grass, let me work. Knox College is a place where the president sits at a window, same window that Lincoln exited when he debated Stephen A. Douglas. The president even looks like Stephen A. Douglas. The president's wife spends time in the girls' dormitory, helping them through their various crises. It's a town where the trees seem to overhang the streets, and the Victorian homes are all two-story wood. And I remember seeing Doug's wife, Sharon, on a ladder painting the exterior of the second floor, so I knew he was a man in charge. Doug is a real Lincoln scholar. He and Rod Davis established and run the Lincoln Studies Center. I happen to be on the board along with 6 or 8 others. And they have done this for a number of years without salary, trying to get Lincoln books into press, assisting scholars and promoting the publications. I think there are 5 planned now through the University of Illinois Press. And Doug has really created almost a Lincoln library on his own. He has just won the prestigious Lincoln Prize the Lehrman Gilder give $50,000 annually to the best book, Judge Best book on Abraham Lincoln. He won it back in 98, and I think it was the year, wasn't it, 98, Doug? 99, with Honor's Voice. Since then, he has put out Lincoln's Informants, Herndon's Lincoln with Rod Davis, both books. The thing I noticed most about Doug, and I've known him for a number of years, is that he is really a dutiful scholar. The tedium of even learning to read Herndon's handwriting is ghastly. And I watched Doug and Rod sit together proofreading with Herndon's handwriting for hours on end. Scholarship takes its toll, and I often refer to these people as having iron bottoms. Scholarship is often a lonely, quiet, solitary work. I discourage too exuberant type personalities from entering such work. But Doug is a friend, a real Lincoln scholar, and comes to you now to speak about a book that I highly recommend, Lincoln's Sword.
Thank you very much. This is a heartwarming sight. I've been coming to the Library of Congress for a long time. I started when I was working on Thomas Jefferson, which I did for many years, and this is the place to study Jefferson. I was interested in his library, his education, his early years, his early reading. Got very much interested in that, and in the course of studying Jefferson's reading in his library, it somehow occurred to me that it would be a good idea to compare him with somebody very different, somebody like Abraham Lincoln, for whom reading was also an important formative experience, but who was in an entirely different situation. Jefferson's family was well off. His father had a library. He's supposed to have read it by the time he was 5. He had tutors. He went to school. He went to boarding school and learned Latin and Greek. He went to college. For that time and place, a very rare education. But he had an omnivorous appetite for books, and so he produced that fantastic library, which became the basis of this library. But it occurred to me to compare him with the reading of Lincoln, who was altogether different. And so I did, and to get at the information about Lincoln's early reading, I had to get into the Herndon White collection here at the library, which contains the material that William H. Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, after Lincoln's assassination, began to compile. He was going to write a biography, and it occurred to him that he didn't know much about Lincoln before he was 30 years old when he had met him, and so he began to correspond with people and interview people who had known Lincoln. And this archive that Herndon put together is really the basis of what we know about Lincoln's early life. I got so involved in it and was so fascinated by it that I persuaded my colleague at Knox College, Rodney Davis, to help me edit it this year's. Almost, to get it done. And it was a tedious job, but what it did was it for the first time made these things available to people, and so that they could read them and make up their own minds about them, because they had sort of got in a bad odor. But I don't want to tell that story too much. I just want to say how I got into the Lincoln business. I got swallowed by the Lincoln whale. I had been swallowed by the Jefferson whale before that, and then I got swallowed by the Lincoln whale. So since that time that I did this comparative study of the readings of Lincoln and Jefferson, I've been involved in Lincoln studies, and my Jefferson projects have all withered and died. So there's no book more connected to the Library of Congress than this one, I'll tell you. My first book about Lincoln was really about those materials, those things, those interviews and letters that Herndon collected. Because when you read them all the way through, you get a different picture than you get in conventional Lincoln biography at the time. And I was struck by several episodes that simply don't appear in the conventional biographies, in the standard biographies. So that's what Honor's Voice was about. These episodes, these aspects of Lincoln's early emergence, I called it, how he came from being a country boy with no formal education to being a guy who gets elected to Congress and a leading lawyer. And that all happened in a short period of time, and so that's what Honor's Voice was about. It was based on those Herndon White materials that are here at the library. Well, when we retired from teaching, my colleague and I decided to do a series of projects, and we invented something called the Lincoln Studies Center, which John has been kind enough to describe to you. And he has been, and other Lincoln scholars have been very helpful to us. They sit on our board of advisors, and we tell them what our ideas are and our projects and how we're going, and we get terrific feedback. But we had just gotten started. We were going to do, having done Herndon's Informants, that's the name of the edition that we did of those materials of Herndon's, we were going to do a new edition of Herndon's biography. And so we started on that, and the Library of Congress called us up and they said, we are putting up images of our Lincoln documents on our website, and we need to have authoritative transcriptions annotated to go with the most important documents. So people, if they have trouble reading them, can consult the transcriptions. And if they don't understand the context or something, they can consult the annotations. So we said, well, no, we have our work laid out for us. We can't do it. But the Library of Congress made us an offer that we couldn't refuse. And so we said, okay. So we put together a staff and we performed the task in the 3 years that they gave us. And part of my job was to transcribe and annotate the documents in Lincoln's handwriting. Well, my reaction to that, I had been working with Jefferson manuscripts for a long time, but the thing that struck me about the Lincoln documents at the Library of Congress, the Lincoln autograph documents, is that they're almost all composition drafts. In other words, if he wrote a letter, he usually wrote it out himself, revised it. Sometimes he would make a second revision. Then when he got it the way he wanted it, he would copy out fair the text, and he would send that to the recipient, but he would keep for his files the composition draft. Well, he went on doing that after he became president. And the same is true with his speeches. He would revise his speeches. As we know, he was good at revising. Everybody at that day was good at revising after they'd already given the speech. And the earliest manuscripts that we have in the collection, almost, are his date to his service in Congress in the 1840s. And lo and behold, they are speeches that he had given on the floor, and he was rewriting, seriously rewriting, completely rewriting. And so I got interested in that. I found out from the Senate historian Don Ritchie, who has written a whole book about this, that the congressmen and senators have always done this, and that, in fact, it's in some ways rather scandalous, because the most famous speech that Lincoln knew when in his day was Webster's reply to Hayne, which had been given on the Senate floor. But Ritchie shows in his history that, in fact, the reporter who was there and who would do something more like a paraphrase, not a verbatim account, Webster was so dissatisfied with that he decided to read, and he completely rewrote the speech. So the speech that kids in Lincoln's day memorized and so forth was not the speech that was given on the floor. It was the speech that Webster wrote afterwards. So I stress this because it's important to know that Lincoln, what I saw in these documents, the composition drafts of letters, the various stages of and revisions of speeches, was a very serious literary craftsman. That's what gave me the idea for this book, and that's why there are 50 illustrations, almost all of them from the Library of Congress, and they're of documents. I don't know how excited you get about documents, but some people do. And I was delighted to read one reviewer who said that the reason he liked the book was he's excited about documents and what they have to tell us. But that he was on my wavelength, that's for sure. Well, that's a little bit about how I came to write this book. I got into other issues. It isn't just about his literary craftsmanship, but it starts there. I want to just read a little bit to give you a little flavor of the book and some of the ideas that come out in it that I talk about in the prologue. In the 4 years that Abraham Lincoln would be president, the American public would gradually discover, much to its collective astonishment, that this unprepossessing Illinois politician had remarkable abilities as a writer. In that brief period, and in the midst of a relentless siege of crises and distractions, he would produce not one or two examples of provocative writing, which would itself be more than most presidents could manage, but a whole series of unmistakably impressive documents. Even though confined to such unpromising formats as ceremonial speeches, messages to Congress, proclamations, and public letters in newspapers, Lincoln's presidential writing proved to be timely, engaging, consistently lucid, compelling in argument, and most important of all, invested with memorable and even inspiring language. Eventually, it began to be recognized that Lincoln's unsuspected literary talent was having a decisive effect in shaping public attitudes and was a telling factor in the success of his policies. Only with his death, however, did it begin to dawn on his contemporaries that Abraham Lincoln's words were destined to find a permanent place in the American imagination. All of this came to the American public, and particularly to the members of the American intelligentsia, as a revelation. His nomination for the presidency over more familiar and established candidates had been a disappointment to the literati, to say the least. The verdict of Charles Francis Adams, son and grandson of presidents, and a leading Republican, was good-natured, friendly, kindly, honest, but frivolous and uncertain. The last thing the intellectual establishment looked for from this folksy, self-educated Prairie politician was literary ability. Quoting, "Perhaps no point in the career of Abraham Lincoln has excited more surprise or comment," wrote John G. Nicolay, "than his remarkable powers of expression." As Lincoln's private secretary and later biographer, Nicolay had witnessed the unfolding of this surprising phenomenon at first hand, a phenomenon that continued to mystify the learned long after his death. Quoting again, "It's a constant puzzle to many men of letters how a person growing up without the advantage of schools and books could have acquired the art which enabled him to write the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural." Unquote. They could accept that such a man might be an exceptional storyteller, but writing, especially writing of a high order, was something somehow different. For Nicolay, this was not so much a mystery as a fact. Quote, "The remarkable thing," he wrote, "was that while nature and opportunity gave him talent and great success at storytelling and extemporaneous talking, he learned to write. Learned to appreciate the value of the pen as an instrument to formulate and record his thought, the more clearly, forcibly, and elegantly to express it." Nicolay's verdict, or something like it, would eventually be accepted by the American public and even by the world at large. Lincoln had thus become one of the most admired of all American writers. Alone among American presidents, Edmund Wilson has written, it's possible to imagine Lincoln grown up in a different milieu, becoming a distinguished writer of a not merely political kind, unquote. If one were to judge the importance of a writer by the familiarity of his words and the depth of meaning and feeling they evoke, few, if any, American writers could compare with him. But for all this implicit recognition of his literary abilities, Lincoln's standing as a great national hero, war president, savior of the Union, emancipator, man of the people, is such that he is still not widely or well understood as a writer. His background in writing, for example, began in his childhood and was far more extensive than is usually realized. For much of his adult life, contributions to newspapers were habitual, encompassing a considerable body of lively political writing, much of which, having been printed anonymously and pseudonymously, will probably never be recovered. Famous in the 1850s for his speeches and his ability on the platform, as in his debates with Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln was always carefully prepared, with many of his arguments and positions written out and polished in advance. He lives in legend as a trial lawyer who was successful before juries, but his skills as an appeals lawyer, whose arguments were submitted in writing to a panel of judges, may have been, though less recognized, more impressive. His surviving personal papers attest that he was, from the time he began to preserve them in the 1840s, a careful and conscientious draftsman who knew the value of revision. And yet, well as we think we know the essential character of this most written about of all Americans, his habits and practice as a lifelong writer have scarcely been explored. Writing is admittedly a solitary activity. While artists have made it possible to summon up a picture of Lincoln reading by firelight, swinging an axe, or speaking from a platform, depictions of him working at his writing desk are rare. An exception is provided by the president's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who late in life sent a correspondent this word picture of his father at work. He was a very deliberate writer, anything but rapid. I cannot remember any peculiarity about his posture. He wrote sitting at a table, and as I remember, in an ordinary posture. As to dictation, I never saw him dictate to anyone, and it certainly was not his practice to do so. He seemed to think nothing of the labor of writing personally, and was accustomed to make many scraps of notes and memoranda. In writing a careful letter, he first wrote it himself, then corrected it, then rewrote the corrected version himself. Though not a familiar pose, this is nonetheless a revealing picture. Perhaps most striking is Robert's identification of a distinctive characteristic that is little recognized, that even though a slow and very deliberate writer, Lincoln was not in the least put off by what most people consider the onerous labor of writing. For anyone interested in Abraham Lincoln's presidential writing, this is an important point to keep in mind. Lincoln's presidency, as is well known, was extraordinarily crisis-ridden and hectic. In spite of his surface calm and good-natured demeanor, his performance in office was totally engaged. While never well-organized or systematic, he was, in fact, an energetic, hands-on, detail-oriented administrator. While never, if any president's performance in office deserved the overused epithet indefatigable, it was his. His willingness to make time for ordinary members of the public and hear personal requests is well known. He kept extremely close tabs on military developments, spending a substantial amount of time in the telegraph office of the War Department. Though the demands of the patronage system drove him almost to distraction, he insisted on involving himself personally in the contentious process of sorting out the competing claims of hundreds of applicants for government posts. One has only to peruse his personal papers, most of which are on view at the Library of Congress website, to get some idea of the amazing number of details that received his personal attention. The testimony of those who saw him regularly is replete with confirming evidence of Lincoln's exertions. As is often pointed out, the physical toll that these efforts exacted is visible in the photographs taken over the course of his 4 years in office. He kept longer hours and in almost every way outworked his subordinates, which prompted an old friend and frequent visitor, Joshua Speed, to inquire about it. I remember asking him on one occasion when he slept. His answer was, just when everybody else is tired out. In the midst of all this exertion, Lincoln found an astonishing amount of time to write. In fact, no small part of that overall effort was given over to writing. Published items from his hand as president in the collected work run into the thousands, and recent searches in the National Archives indicate that there are many more that have gone unrecorded. As these discoveries show, Lincoln not only sent a constant stream of small notes and endorsements to various government offices and officials, but he sometimes drafted complicated documents that were issued over the signature of his subordinates. He wrote frequently to his generals as a way of keeping in touch and offering advice. It's indicative that his reaction to his first taste of military defeat, the disastrous First Battle of Bull Run, was to take up his pen, staying up all night to set down on paper what needed to be done to redeem the situation. In short, he responded to almost every important development during his presidency, and to many that were not so important, with some act of writing. Except for ceremonial proclamations, he seems to have delegated relatively little official writing and rarely dictated the documents that went out over his signature. By almost any means of gauging his presidential activity, it becomes apparent both the activity and its products were indispensable to Lincoln's way of performing his office. But writing, especially the drafting of a consequential text, usually requires time, quiet, and the absence of interruptions, the very things that Lincoln most often lacked. How did he manage this? Another recollection of Joshua Speed's helps to explain how so much writing was possible. He had a wonderful faculty that way, Speed recalled. He might be writing an important document, be interrupted in the midst of a sentence, turn his attention to other matters entirely foreign to the subject on which he was engaged, and take up his pen and begin where he left off without reading the previous part of the sentence. But the record also reveals that Lincoln frequently sought sanctuary in the telegraph room, at the soldier's home, and even behind the usually open doors of his own office to immerse himself in his writing. Indeed, there's more than a little to suggest that writing was often a form of refuge for Lincoln, a place of intellectual retreat from the chaos and confusion of office, where he could sort through conflicting opinions and order his thoughts with words. Well, I hope that gives you some sense of the direction that I was taking. I think, not to give an answer, but to show you what should be considered in asking the question, this question that people still ask, that Nicolay says was a question that people could not stop asking even after his death. How did he manage to write so well and be so little educated? I think it helps by understanding that he started out as a child as a writer. He even told a campaign biographer, one that we can trust, that when he first learned to write in Kentucky, he would have been 6 years old, that he remembers that he liked to shape the letters. He liked learning his letters. And so that he went around wherever he could in the dust or in the snow, he would write the letters. When he got to Indiana at the age of 7, he quickly learned how to write, and he was a neighborhood secretary. Many of people like his parents were illiterate. They couldn't write. They could read a little bit, but they couldn't write. And Lincoln would write their letters for them. When Herndon went back to Indiana and interviewed people who had known Lincoln when he was growing up there, he lived in Indiana from the time he was 7 to the time he was 21. They're full of stories about Lincoln as a writer. He was a poet. He wrote satires. He made fun of people by writing poetry about them, making them the butt of his poems. He wrote essays. If he had a cause, he wrote an essay about it. They remembered that he wrote an essay about cruelty to animals. Lincoln was notoriously tender-hearted. And, of course, the children that he played with, being children, typical children, were cruel to animals that they could catch and torture. And he opposed this. And so he wrote an essay about it. He wrote an essay about temperance, which was the big social reform movement that hit even his small community. He wrote an essay about the American way of government. And so what we know is that as a child and as a teenager, he's writing. His stepmother says that he was a very serious, diligent writer, and that he was always writing things. And if he didn't have paper, he wrote on other things. Boards he would scrape off. But he was constantly writing. So given this background, this is just an indication. This is the kind of thing that people didn't know. But he had been a writer all of his life. He cared about writing. He cared about words. He also cared about clarity, and this may be another clue. His stepmother told a story that Lincoln actually told the same story to another person, so it's a pretty good chance that this story is on target. And it was that one of the things that Lincoln, as a boy, disliked was something that he didn't understand. Somebody used a word he didn't understand, or if they tried to explain something that he didn't understand, he couldn't be still until he'd sorted out, he'd clarified this thing. And obviously one way that he clarified was to put the idea in writing, to try to put it down. And so I think there's no doubt that this is another indication of how he came to be a good writer. As I said, he continued to write all the rest of his time up to the presidency for the newspapers, but these are mostly anonymous and pseudonymous things, and most of them we're never going to know for sure if they're his. But he was writing all the time. And we have in his papers here at the Library of Congress experiments that clearly date to his debating years in the 50s when he's attacking the idea of extending slavery into the territories. And we know because we have the fragments, and then we hear in the debates he uses these things. So he's working ahead of time. And his speeches, as you know, and this is quite striking, Douglas kind of gave the same speech over and over again. Lincoln kept trying to give different aspects of his philosophy, and Lincoln's ideas are more complicated than Douglas's. And he makes discriminations. And it's the kind of thing that you think through. Those ideas don't come to you on the fly. You think them through. So I think we see this. But what this all means is that Lincoln comes to the presidency with a hidden asset. They think he's a rube without education. They're going to have to find somebody to write his state papers for him. I used the phrase that I found a newspaper editor wrote at the time Lincoln came to the presidency: "Who will write this ignorant man's state papers?" And I think it was a help. And Lincoln didn't try to be anything that he wasn't. They had, the public and especially the intelligentsia, had a seriously wrong notion about him. They thought that he was crude, unrefined, they said nasty things about him, meaning that he was stupid and so forth. And you can tell that he isn't dodging that. And I think that there's purpose in all of this. George Templeton Strong, the great diarist, a very well-educated man, a wonderful diarist, Wall Street lawyer. he's involved with the Sanitary Commission. He has a series of meetings with Lincoln. Comes back from his first meeting, and he writes in his diary, he writes out a story that Lincoln told in Hoosier dialect. Here's Lincoln sitting around with very distinguished, very well-educated people, and he's telling them stories in Hoosier dialect. Templeton Strong says, this man is a barbarian. He's a Yahoo. He's a Scythian. And then he says, but even so, I think he's honest, and I think he's reliable, trustworthy. I think he's sincere. And I don't think it ever dawned on George Templeton Strong, but I think what Lincoln was trying to do with this group in behaving the way, as a barbarian, as a Yahoo, was to say, I may be a Yahoo, but I'm honest, and I'm trustworthy, I'm reliable, I'm sincere. And that was a lot to get across to these important people that he had to work with. But eventually, so one of the stories that I get onto is the business about the hidden asset. If Lincoln wrote something good, the word would be, well, this must be the work of one of his educated cabinet members. This must be Seward or Chase. But the truth is that people kept hinting that it would be a good idea if he would let really experienced people write his state papers, and he would have none of it. He would say, no, I have to write them myself. And so there isn't any doubt that eventually that he made the right decision, that he could write better than the people than people like Seward. And of course, we know that because we have these wonderful things where he asks Seward for advice about the first inaugural. Seward says, well, I think you need a more conciliatory close, and he writes him a little draft of how it might go. And we have that, and then Lincoln takes that and rewrites it so that it's one of the most moving and memorable passages in all of American literature, the better angels of our nature. And if you read Seward's version, it doesn't measure up by any means. I want to just say a couple of things about things that I thought was especially interesting that I discovered that I thought were that tell us more than just about the way he wrote. His son mentioned these little notes and memoranda. It turns out that Lincoln is always making little notes and memoranda, and people close to him all testify to it. He's thinking ahead. He gets ideas. He gets a phrase, maybe even a word. We don't have many of these scraps, so we can only conjecture. But Herndon says that the way he wrote the House Divided speech in 1858 was that he kept tearing off little scraps of paper and writing things on them. And he'd put them in his hat. And when it came time to write his speech, he dumped the hat out onto the table. And then he arranged the little pieces of paper. And then he numbered them. And then he took the scraps in their numerical order and he wrote out his speech. Now, what's so interesting about that is that it's exactly what he does with a famous letter that he wrote to Erastus Corning, defending his curtailment of civil liberties. The country got very worried about the use of habeas corpus, the arresting of newspaper editors. And when Ambrose Burnside arrested the most notorious critic of Lincoln's policies, Clement Vallandigham, people were really concerned. They thought, well, the military gets to decide what's political and what's unpatriotic and so forth. And there was a big concern in the country. Lincoln met that concern with the so-called Corning letter. He got a petition from Albany, New York Democrats, a meeting. They protested, and he replied. But he wasn't just reacting to the Albany Democrats. He had been preparing all along. We have this wonderful story. A congressman comes to see him several months later, and he said, Mr. Lincoln, I must tell you that I really admired that letter that you wrote to Corning. And Lincoln said, well, let me tell you how I wrote that letter. and he's sitting at his desk. He says, every time I had an idea about that subject, I would take a scrap of paper and write it down. And I wouldn't let any of those ideas escape me. He says, and I put them in this drawer right here. Opens the drawer. He's acting it out. And he says, when I got that Corning letter, when I got that petition, I just opened that drawer and I had the whole speech right in there. Now that's wonderful because we don't have the scraps of paper, but we do have his handwritten drafts of the Corning letter. And they're quite interesting. If you're interested in the way in which Lincoln works and the way he moves towards getting a completed message. But what I try to argue is that there are a whole number of instances of this. Lincoln is what I call a pre-writer. He writes in advance of things. And then when the occasion comes, he's ready with something. I think the first public letter, he was much criticized for writing letters to the public in the newspaper because it was supposed to be beneath the dignity of the office. And there was a lot of complaints about it, except that people admitted that it was actually a very good letter. This is the famous Greeley letter. Apparently Lincoln was, in the summer of 62, late summer of 62, things were going terribly. He wanted to declare emancipation, but his cabinet thought they should wait till a better time. And so he had to do something, and he was drafting this short, pithy message. And he read it to somebody and says, how can I get this before the public? The next day, Horace Greeley published a long, scolding, ill-tempered letter to the president in public, giving him hell about his administration and his failures. And 2 days later, what Lincoln had read to his friend appears in the newspaper, in another newspaper, with a little introductory part as the reply. So it wasn't a reply at all. He was using Greeley's attack as an excuse. There's evidence that he's pre-writing all the time. I talked about the fact that he revised after delivery. This is a different situation. He's writing in advance. Now, what I argue is that this tells us more than just about what kind of writer he was. It tells us what kind of man he was, what kind of leader he was. He is thinking ahead of time, and his law partners, the people at the bar all understood this because they knew him as a guy who was always anticipating what was the most important thing. He was a guy who notoriously studied the other side of the case first. He wanted to know everything about the other side, the opposition. He wanted to know that case to the bottom. He was a person who wanted to be ready at the moment. He didn't want to be caught unawares, didn't want to be caught by surprise. He embodies what I think Shakespeare is talking about, the quality of readiness. Hamlet says, readiness is all. And I think he was, as Bacon would say, a ready man. He was somebody who thought ahead. Herndon called this being long-headed. Lincoln was long-headed, he said. In other words, he was. And I argue that he raises anticipation to a fine art. I want to leave some room for questions, so I'll stop there. Thanks. Yes.
You mentioned that Lincoln responded to so many events in his presidency through writing. I was wondering about how he responded to some personal tragedies, especially the death of two sons during his lifetime. Did he work through that tragedy in writing as well? Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. The question is, did Lincoln respond to some of the tragedies in his life with writing? He's supposed to have written. The evidence is a little dodgy, but and the quality of the verse is unprepossessing, but he is supposed to have written a little verse on the death of Eddie. I don't know that he wrote anything in response to the really devastating loss of Willie in the White House. He did he was a serious poet, and he was serious about his poetry up till about the time he went to Congress. But I think he didn't want anybody to know it. It was all sub rosa, and but no, I'm not sure I can shed very much light on that. Yes.
Are there any particular phrases or sentences of Lincoln's that you could discuss for their literary quality? Maybe perhaps some that aren't as well known as your book, I presume, does that sort of thing.
Well, yes, I try not to spend too much time expatiating about the loveliness of his prose. I almost take that for granted, but I do try to talk about the way, what his craftsmanship, what the changes tend to show us, and what kinds of things they show us he's interested in. The short answer there is sound. He had to read everything to people. He said he needed to read it to a live audience. It didn't work to just read it aloud to himself in his office. He always was working by sound. And if you look at, well, for example, the second inaugural, which is really a marvel, he was dissatisfied with the way it ended. And he pasted a slip over the last two lines and he wrote out a new ending. Well, thanks to the people in the conservation department, we're able to read what's underneath. And so we read the original ending, we can compare it with what he did, and essentially he's giving it a more fluent feel. He's giving it a little more musical, lilting quality. There's no meaning change at all. So I'm not sure how much I've helped you, but.
Yes, but would it be feasible to tell us the change right now?
No. But you can find it in the book. This is the place to look. Yes. Oh, Jeff.
Doug, yeah, hi. Were there any writers that Lincoln mentioned during his life, wrote about that he especially admired, perhaps?
Well,
borrowed from?
I think Shakespeare above all, and Lincoln's reading, we've discovered he's a great reader, but he's a narrow reader, a narrow range. He's not like Jefferson, who reads everything. And Lincoln tends to read the things that he likes over and over again, and he could recite most of them. And he says that everybody knew that Shakespeare was his great favorite, and he says there's some plays of Shakespeare's I've never read, but some of them I've probably read more than any unprofessional writer or reader. So I think he knew where the well was, the well that worked for him, and he kept going back. And I would say Shakespeare, certainly the Bible. He knew the Bible because it was probably the only book his family had. He probably had read the Bible when he was a small boy over and over again. He knew it very, very well. Everybody is certain of that. And he continued to read it in the White House. As a young man, Burns, very, very devoted to Burns. People remembering him, they thought he had memorized all of Burns, that he went around reciting. For a period, he read Byron. He quoted Byron a number of times. I think those would be the main ones. Yeah.
As an extension of that question, what about the King James Bible? I had read years ago in college that Lincoln read this over and over in his early days. But then I recently read one of the new biographies by I can't remember, Donald biography, and I couldn't find anything in there about that.
Well, I think that yes, okay. The question is, did he read the Bible over and over as a young man? I think that he did. I think the evidence is there. I'm not sure why Donald doesn't mention that, but I think it's very safe to say, because his knowledge of the Bible was phenomenal, and you have in Herndon's materials, you have ministers who testify to this, say that they were always astonished. He wasn't a churchgoer very much, but he knew the Bible better than lots of the ministers. So, He, of course, had a very retentive memory, a monumental memory, and that helps. But there's plenty of evidence that he kept reading the Bible. And I would be willing to bet, I don't know of any evidence for this, but I'd be willing to bet it's like Shakespeare. There's parts of the Bible that he liked, and he would read them over and over and over again. Yes?
How did people in those days get an image of the president? I mean, today we use TV or radio. At that time, all they had were newspapers. Right?
Yes, newspaper.
How many people were able to read?
It was, comparatively speaking, a very highly literate society, especially the North. No, they had an astonishing appetite for political discourse, and the political meetings attracted huge crowds. And this was a time of turmoil, political turmoil, and so this just intensified that interest. But what people would read, if you go back and look at the newspapers, is just an awful lot of political material of the kind that Lincoln was really the master of. And it's kind of amazing that Lincoln, who had lots of literary ability and thought about going in different directions, but he eventually put all of his eggs into the political basket, so that his writing is almost all political that we know about, and yet somehow it's memorable. Yes?
Was there any research done or research that's possible when he was here as a congressman in the 1840s as to what he checked out or what he read at the Library of Congress?
You know, I don't think we have the checkout records for that period. We have the checkout records, John can tell you, for the presidency. There again, we can see by the fact that he checked out French novels that they weren't all for him. So we can't be entirely sure what was checked out to the presidents, to the White House, was his doing. But there are interesting things there that clearly he must have been looking at. Yes?
Is there any evidence that he studied classical manuals of rhetoric or classical orations and translation?
There isn't, except insofar as these textbooks that he used as a young man, Murray's Reader, Kirkham's Grammar, Scott's Lessons, they would talk about rhetoric. There would be some theoretical talk about rhetoric in there. It's never been clear to me that he was influenced by that. But certainly his writing embodies, if you think of Aristotle's rhetoric, and he talks about what makes a persuasive argument, what makes he understood those kinds of things very, very well. And of course, the rhetoric in the sense of the way it was studied in the Middle Ages, where they gave a Latin name to every form of argument and figure of speech, he wouldn't have thought that was worthwhile to study the names of all of those things. He knew what antithesis was and so forth, but he had an instinctive feel for the language, and through the language he becomes a master of certain figures. Yes.
Well, two really quick questions. One, you mentioned French novels. Did he know any foreign languages? And two,
No.
The genres that you mentioned that he liked to read were literary genres.
Yes.
Did he read anything else like history, biography, the speeches of other statesmen?
He did. The first answer is no, he didn't know any other languages, but he actually, I think, took a fling at Latin grammar and German grammar. But he didn't push either one of those very far. But no, it's true that most of his reading was we would call literary, but then he did know the writings of Jefferson. He knew the writings of the statesmen. He did, especially as a young man, when he was at New Salem between the ages of 22 and 28, he really was devouring a lot of books. There were a lot more books in New Salem than in Indiana. And he was reading some biography. He didn't like biography very much. He thought that this was just, that they were not critical. They were just telling you the good stuff about the, but also I think, But I think not so much in later years. Later years, it's his reading is his favorites, rereading, and things that bear on the political situation.
We have a last question here.
Thank you. Lincoln seemed to have a great understanding about, great sympathy for slavery, for handicapped people, and for military, for the soldiers. So, do you think that he also had an understanding for medical studies and society on the humanities and medical level?
Gee, I'm not sure. He was a humanitarian. There's no question about that. His law partner, Herndon, says that personally he was very tender-hearted, that if you were in trouble or if you were hurt, any person or an animal, he would respond emotionally. He couldn't keep from responding. But he didn't. But that his real passion was for ideas, and so that he was always thinking. He was attracted to abstract. Herndon would get involved in social reforms, common schools, prostitution, women's rights, all of these things, health. Herndon would get involved at the local level and work on these things. He could never interest Lincoln in working at that level, but he knew that Lincoln was a tender-hearted person, sympathetic to people with problems, but his real interest was in the larger, in the area of ideas. I don't know if that helps or not.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to have to end this, but we are having a book signing, and you'll have a chance to talk with Doug a little more during the book signing. I also would like to thank the Manuscript Division for co-sponsoring the talk. I also would like to introduce, if she would just stand up, the new relatively new executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, Eileen Makevich. Eileen. If you didn't already know it, you can see that the Library of Congress is definitely Lincoln land, and we're pleased that the Bicentennial Commission is here at the library, as have been other organizations in the past that have taken advantage of the wonderful Lincoln materials, not only in the Manuscript Division, but in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, in the Prints and Photographs Division, and throughout the library. Two of the former chiefs of the Manuscript Division, Roy Basler and David Mearns, were also Lincoln specialists, and so we have quite a Lincoln history, which is continuing today. I'm going to leave Doug here at the table, and if you can make a line maybe coming across here to get your book signed, and let's conclude with one more round of applause for a wonderful speaker, Douglas.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.